psychology presents a number of perspectives on the causes of crime. Theories exploring the relationship between crime and individual personality, social factors, cognition, and development factors are of importance. These psychological theories have different degrees of focus on individual, family, group, and societal psychology. The issue of human violence is also a major topic within the academic discipline of psychology. As biosocial theorists do, psychologists focus on how individual characteristics may interact with the social environment to produce a violent event. However, rather than focus on the biological basis of crime, psychologists focus on how mental processes impact individual propensities for violence. Psychologists are often interested in the association between learning, intelligence, and personality and aggressive behavior. In the previous chapter, we understood a few theories of crime. In continuation, we will now discuss the psychological theory of crime. As part of this, we briefly will understand some of the major psychological perspectives that have attempted to explain violent behavior. These perspectives include the psychodynamic perspective, behavioral theory, cognitive theory, and personality theory. We will also explore the possible relationship between mental illness and violence. The psychodynamic perspective is largely based on the groundbreaking ideas of Sigmund Freud. A detailed discussion of Freud's theory of psychoanalysis is beyond the scope of this report. It is sufficient to note that Freud thought that human behavior, including violent behavior, was the product of unconscious forces operating within a person's mind. Freud also felt that early childhood experiences had a profound impact on adolescent and adult behavior. Freud, for example, believed that conflicts that occur at various psychosexual stages of development might impact an individual's ability to operate normally as an adult. Bartel 2002. For Freud, aggression was thus a basic human impulse that is repressed in well-adjusted people who have experienced a normal childhood. However, if the aggressive impulse is not controlled or is repressed to an unusual degree, some aggression can leak out of the unconscious and a person can engage in random acts of violence. Freud referred to this as displaced aggression. It is interesting to note that Freud himself did not theorize much about crime or violence. The psychoanalyst who is perhaps most closely associated with the study of criminality is Auguste Ayacon. Unlike many of the sociologists of his day, Ayacon felt that exposure to stressful social environments did not automatically produce crime or violence. After all, most people are exposed to extreme stress and do not engage in serious forms of criminality. Ayacon felt that stress only produced crime in those who had a particular mental state known as latent delinquency. Latent delinquency, according to Ayacon, results from inadequate childhood socialization and manifests itself in the need for immediate gratification, impulsivity, a lack of empathy for others, and the inability to feel guilt. Ayacon 1935. Since Ayacon's early work, psychoanalysts have come to view violent criminals as individuals who are unable to control their impulsive, pleasure-seeking drives. Dodge 1979. Often because of childhood neglect or abuse, violence-prone individuals suffer from weak or damaged egos that render them unable to deal with stressful circumstances within conventional society. It is also argued that youth with weak egos are immature and easily led into crime and violence by deviant peers. Andrews and Bonta, 1994. In their most extreme form, underdeveloped egos or superegos can lead to psychosis and the inability to feel sympathy for the victims of crime. In some, psychodynamic theories depict the violent offender as an impulsive, easily frustrated person who is dominated by events or issues that occurred in early childhood. The most significant criticism of the psychoanalytic perspective is that it is based on information derived from therapists' subjective interpretations of interviews with a very small number of patients. Englander, 2007. In other words, the theory has not yet been subject to rigorous scientific verification. Nonetheless, it is important to stress that basic psychodynamic principles have had a major impact on the subsequent development of criminological thought. For example, many other theories of violence have come to stress the importance of the family and early childhood experiences. Similarly, a number of sociological and criminological theories stress that violent criminals are impulsive and lack empathy for others. Behavioral and cognitive theories. Behavior theory maintains that all human behavior, including violent behavior, is learned through interaction with the social environment. Behaviorists argue that people are not born with a violent disposition. Rather, they learn to think and act violently as a result of their day-to-day experiences. Bandura, 1977. These experiences, proponents of the behaviorist tradition maintain, might include observing friends or family being rewarded for violent behavior, or even observing the glorification of violence in the media. Behavioral theories. Studies of family life, for example, show that aggressive children often model the violent behaviors of their parents. Studies have also found that people who live in violent communities learn to model the aggressive behavior of their neighbors. Barton, 2002. Behavioral theorists have argued that the following four factors help produce violence. A stressful event or stimulus like a threat, challenge, or assault that heightens arousal. Aggressive skills or techniques learned through observing others. A belief that aggression or violence will be socially rewarded by, for example, reducing frustration, enhancing self-esteem, providing material goods, or earning the praise of other people. A value system that condones violent acts within certain social contexts. Early empirical tests of these four principles were promising. Barton, 2002. Cognitive development and violence. Cognitive theorists focus on how people perceive their social environment and learn to solve problems. The moral and intellectual development perspective is the branch of cognitive theory that is most associated with the study of crime and violence. Piaget, 1932, was one of the first psychologists to argue that people's reasoning abilities develop in an orderly and logical fashion. He argued that during the first stage of development, the sensor-motor stage, children respond to their social environment in a simple fashion by focusing their attention on interesting objects and developing their motor skills. By the final stage of the development, the formal operations stage, children have developed into mature adults who are capable of complex reasoning and abstract thought. Kohlberg, 1969, applied the concept of moral development to the study of criminal behavior. He argued that all people travel through 6 different stages of moral development. At the first stage, people only obey the law because they are afraid of punishment. By the 6th stage, however, people obey the law because it is an assumed obligation and because they believe in the universal principles of justice, equity, and respect for others. In his research, Kohlberg found that violent youth were significantly lower in their moral development than non-violent youth, even after controlling for social background. Kohlberg, 1973. Since his pioneering efforts, Studies have consistently found that people who obey the law simply to avoid punishment, that is, out of self interest, are more likely to commit acts of violence than are people who recognize and sympathize with the fundamental rights of others. Higher levels of moral reasoning, on the other hand, are associated with acts of altruism, generosity, and non-violence. Veneziano and Veneziano, 1992. In sum, the weight of the evidence suggests that people with lower levels of moral reasoning will engage in crime and violence when they think they can get away with it. On the other hand, even when presented with the opportunity, people with higher levels of moral reasoning will refrain from criminal behavior because they think it is wrong. Another area of cognitive theory that has received considerable attention from violence researchers involves the study of information processing. Psychological research suggests that when people make decisions, they engage in a series of complex thought processes. First, they encode and interpret the information or stimuli they are presented with. Then they search for a proper response or appropriate action. And finally, they act on their decision. Dodge, 1986. According to information processing theorists, violent individuals may be using information incorrectly when they make their decision. Violence-prone youth, for example, may see people as more threatening or aggressive than they actually are. This may cause some youth to react with violence at the slightest provocation. According to this perspective, aggressive children are more vigilant and suspicious than normal youth are, a factor that greatly increases their likelihood of engaging in violent behavior. Consistent with this perspective, research suggests that some youth who engage in violent attacks on others actually believe that they are defending themselves even when they have totally misinterpreted the level of threat. Lokman, 1987. Recent research also indicates that male rapists often have little sympathy for their own victims, but do in fact empathize with the female victims of other sexual offenders. This finding suggests that because of information processing issues, some offenders can't recognize the harm they are doing to others. Personality and violence. The psychological concept of personality has been defined as stable patterns of behavior, thoughts, or actions that distinguish one person from another. A number of early criminologists argued that certain personality types are more prone to criminal behavior. The Gluck and Gluck, 1950, for example, identified a number of personality traits that they felt were associated with violence, including self-assertiveness, defiance, extroversion, narcissism, and suspicion. More recently, researchers have linked violent behaviors to traits such as hostility, egoism, self-centeredness, spitefulness, jealousy, and indifference to or lack of empathy for others. Criminals have also been found to lack ambition and perseverance, to have difficulty controlling their tempers and other impulses, and to be more likely than conventional people are to hold unconventional beliefs. The multiphasic personality inventory and the multidimensional personality questionnaire have frequently been used to assess the personality characteristics of young people. The use of these scales has consistently produced a statistically significant relationship between certain personality characteristics and criminal behavior. Adolescents who are prone to violence typically respond to frustrating events or situations with wrong negative emotions. They often feel stressed, anxious, and irritable in the face of adverse social conditions. Psychological testing also suggests that crime-prone youth are also impulsive, paranoid, aggressive, hostile, and quick to take action against perceived threats. There is considerable debate about the cause and direction of the personality violence association. On the one hand, some scholars have argued that there is a direct causal link between certain personality traits and criminal behavior. However, others maintain that personality characteristics interact with other factors to produce crime and violence. For example, defiant, impulsive youth often have less than stellar educational and work histories. Poor education and employment histories subsequently block opportunities for economic success. These blocked opportunities in turn lead to frustration, deprivation, and ultimately criminal activity. Miller and Linham, 2001. Psychopathy and violence. Research suggests that some serious violent offenders may have a serious personality defect commonly known as psychopathy, sociopathy, or antisocial personality disorder. Psychopaths are impulsive, have low levels of guilt, and frequently violate the rights of others. They have been described as egocentric, manipulative, cold-hearted, forceful, and incapable of feeling anxiety or remorse over their violent actions. Psychopaths are also said to be able to justify their actions to themselves so that they always appear to be reasonable and justified. Considering these negative personality traits, it is perhaps not surprising that recent studies show that psychopaths are significantly more prone to violence compared with the normal population. Furthermore, the research evidence also suggests that psychopaths often continue with their criminal careers long after others have aged out of crime. It has been estimated that approximately 30% of all prison inmates in the United States are psychopaths. More recent projections, however, place this estimate closer to 10%. However, psychopaths are particularly overrepresented among chronic offenders. Indeed, it is estimated that up to 80% of chronic offenders exhibit psychopathic personalities. In sum, research suggests that psychopaths have a significantly higher likelihood of violence than others do. However, experts also stress that not all psychopaths become violent. In fact, the majority of people convicted of violent crimes in Canada and the US do not have a psychopathic personality. Psychologists think that a number of early childhood factors might contribute to the development of a psychopathic or sociopathic personality. These factors include having an emotionally unstable parent, parental rejection, lack of love during childhood, and inconsistent discipline. Young children in the first 3 years of life who do not have opportunity to emotionally bond with their mothers experience a sudden separation from their mothers or see changes in their mother figures are at particularly high risk of developing a psychopathic personality. Intelligence and violence. Another major area of psychological inquiry involves the possible relationship between intelligence and crime. Criminologists working in the early 20th century often argued that intelligence is strongly associated with criminal behavior. People with low intelligence, they argued, were much more likely to engage in crime and violence than people with high intelligence were. Support for this hypothesis was garnered from studies that directly compared the IQ scores of adolescents with IQ scores derived from the general population. In general, these pioneering studies reported that the IQ scores of delinquents were significantly lower than the IQ scores of normal controls. Goddard, 1920, Haley and Bronner, 1926. Mental illness and violence. A recent survey of more than 6,000 respondents from 14 countries found that approximately 10% of the adult population suffers from some form of mental illness, ranging from depression to schizophrenia. Siegel and McCormick, 2006. Rates of mental illness may be even higher among youth. For example, one study found that 1 in 5 children and adolescents residing in Ontario suffer from a significant mental health disorder. The most common disorders among youth include depression, substance abuse, and conduct disorder. Research also suggests that mental health issues may put young people at risk of engaging in violent behavior. For example, after an extensive review of the literature, Monohan noted that no matter how many social and demographic factors are statistically taken into account, there appears to be a greater than chance relationship between mental disorder and violent behavior. Mental disorder is a statistically significant risk factor for the occurrence of violence. Research suggests that depression, a relatively common disorder among youth, may be related to aggression. For example, one recent study documented that affective disorders are related to aggression at both home and school. This study is important because other studies have found a link between depression and both property crime and substance use, but not violence. Englander, 2007. However, the authors of this study do note that they only focused on minor forms of aggression, not serious violence. Interestingly, a number of studies have found that while minor depression is related to an increased probability of minor criminality, major bipolar depression is not at all related to serious violent behavior. Indeed, major depression may be too crippling a disorder to permit someone to form intent and act out in a violent manner. Similarly, some experts have suggested that youth suffering from affective disorders are actually more likely to withdraw and harm themselves than to act violently towards others. Additional research suggests that particular types of mental illness, including schizophrenia, are more associated with violent behavior than others are. For example, people who suffer from paranoid delusions that others are trying to harm them or feel that their minds are being controlled by outside forces are more vulnerable to periodic episodes of rage and violence than are those who do not have these symptoms. Studies have also found that up to 75% of juvenile murderers suffer from some form of mental illness, including psychopathy and schizophrenia. Another study followed 1,000 English children from birth to their 21st birthday and found that only 2% of the sample met the DSM-3 diagnostic criteria for mental illness. However, this 2% was responsible for 50% of the violent incidents that were documented during the study period. In sum, research gives tentative support for the idea that mental disturbance or illness may be a root or underlying cause of violent behavior. It is extremely important to note, however, that some scholars suggest that this relationship may be spurious. In other words, the same social conditions that produce violent behavior, including parental neglect, child abuse, violent victimization, racism, peer pressure, and poverty, may also cause mental illness. Studies also suggest that most people with severe mental illnesses do not engage in serious violence or criminality. It is also interesting to observe that at the societal level, rates of violent crime have actually decreased at the same time that mentally ill populations have been deinstitutionalized. A note on substance abuse and violence. Substance abuse, including alcoholism, has now been formally recognized as a mental illness. Research has also established that there is a strong positive correlation between levels of substance abuse and violence. For example, a corrections Canada survey of over 6,000 inmates, many of them violent offenders, found that 48% admitted to using illegal drugs at the time of their offense. Siegel and McCormick, 2006. Similarly, a recent US study found that over 80% of people arrested for violent crimes tested positive for illegal drugs at the time of their apprehension. Furthermore, numerous cross-national surveys of prison inmates reveal that the vast majority were under the influence of drugs and or alcohol at the time of their offense. In 1988, it is hypothesized that alcohol and drugs can impact violence in three ways. First of all, alcohol and drugs may have psychopharmacological effects that impair cognition and subsequently increase the likelihood of aggressive behavior. Many have argued, for example, that the physiological impact of substance use serves to reduce social inhibitions and thus frees or enables people to act on their violent impulses. Others, however, have argued that this disinhibition effect is culturally specific. Anthropologists have shown, for example, that the social effects of alcohol vary dramatically from country to country. In some nations, alcohol intoxication is related to violence, in others, it is not. Is it possible that the effect of alcohol and drugs are socially defined? In some societies, people may come to believe that there is a strong relationship between intoxication and violence. If so, some people may come to use alcohol and drugs as an excuse or justification for their violent behavior. Studies do suggest that people are more forgiving of people who engage in violent acts while intoxicated and are less forgiving of people who engage in violence while sober. A second way that substance abuse may increase violence is by increasing economic need. Many drug addicts, for example, engage in violent crimes, including robbery, in order to gain enough money to support their habits. Violence is also related to competition between drug traffickers. Indeed, any lucrative drug trade may attract ruthless individuals and gangs who are willing to resort to violence in order to control markets, territories, or ensure the repayment of drug debts. Drug traffickers may also draw the attention of other predatory criminals who specifically target them for robbery because they carry large volumes of cash and cannot report their victimization to the police. Portley and Tanner, 2007. Conclusion. To conclude, we can say that psychological theories focus on the identification and treatment of individual traits that may predispose people to violent behavior. As such, psychological theorists have been charged with ignoring larger social forces, including poverty, social inequality, neighborhood disorganization, and racism, that may have a strong impact on violent behavior. Such factors, however, have been considered by a wide variety of sociological perspectives on crime. We begin our discussion of these theories in the next chapter.